On the right is the last group, the corvids that we tend to see around human settlements today. So it's most likely that they also would have followed the campsites of the Paleolithic people and eaten the scraps that they had left over. Now, even after this just brief little foray into the timeline of bird art, there's already something that I can say about a relationship between bird art and science. And that's that bird artists throughout the history of time have accidentally recorded birds that have gone extinct before science has really come to know them very well. And this is true even of Paleolithic artists. So these are some examples from New Zealand, from Maori art. On the top we have the giant eagle, which is now extinct, and also the moa. And these birds we only really know in terms of their skeletons and their fossils and some pictures in the cave wall. And so it's really nice to have these because A, we know that they were there. B, we know that people did interact with them in some way. C, we might have some basic idea of what their plumage may have looked like, which of course we can't recreate from fossils. Here's a nice example of another, the great flightless auk. On the left is a cave picture from Europe. On the right is William McGillivray's painting from 1839. And he was lucky enough to see this guy before it really was wiped out. And you can see how amazingly accurate the Paleolithic people would have been in portraying some of the morphology of the bird. So you can look at the bill shape, even the white plumage there above the eye and also on the belly. So it's amazing that some of this art, as old as it is and as rudimentary as we consider it today, is really accurate in terms of capturing some of these elements of the birds. This has allowed scientists today to not only get an idea of plumage, but also to kind of reconstruct what certain physical features may have been used for. And this is especially true in mammals, but can also be the case in birds. Now, unfortunately, not all of these examples are 100% accurate. So this is Roland Savory's image of the dodo, which has kind of become the ubiquitous picture. This is what we think of as what this bird looks like. But on the right, you can see an image of the skeleton. And just at first glance, you can see these don't really match up. And in fact, if you overlay them, there is this discrepancy in the posture, in the bill shape, and how squat it is versus how tall it is. So okay, it's not always rocket science here in terms of what these artists are producing, but at the same time, we do have this image of the different patterns of plumage, the different colors, the different textures of it, and that's way more, as I said, than we would ever have had just from the fossil record, or from a dried up skin that was brought back from an expedition. All right, so now we can resume our journey. And here we are in less ancient bird art, and this is a rather giant category for which I apologize. But the thing is that during this period, you have all of these civilizations that are starting up in different places of the world. And really, when you've got these immense civilizations starting and going through their first throes of being together, you all have kind of the same general process. And that's why all this art is lumped together, because we see a lot of the same trends. So for the first time, for sure, we have bird art in more elevated uses. And I use that kind of broadly to indicate that we are sure now that these images are used in a ritualistic, symbolic, religious sort of way, whereas some people only guess that about the Paleolithic art. For sure, we have bird deities, so deities that look like birds or have parts of birds or have as their symbol a bird. We also have birds being used for common people who want to express status or power or wealth. And of course, we also have bird hybrids that are famous today. The phoenix is an example of the thunderbird, that sort of thing. So here's an example from a culture we're all pretty familiar with, ancient Egypt. On the left here, we have a couple of images that would have been found in a palace or in a pyramid, a burial site. And both of these indicate the status of someone. Up here we have people that are out netting geese. Down here we have people who are herding cranes or herons. And both of these would have indicated that someone was wealthy enough to employ other people to go out and either get them birds to eat or bring birds back to put in some sort of a menagerie or a zoo type setting. And only someone who had a lot of wealth and resources could afford to do that sort of thing. On the right we have a couple of images of Egyptian gods. Both Ra and Horus were sky-oriented gods, the sun and the sky. And so we have a very accurate choice here of a falcon to represent them. On the bottom, that's Thoth, the god of writing and knowledge. An ibis, who would have been found in a wetland-type area where you would get papyrus, so that makes a lot of sense. So even though these images have to do with religion and some very lofty thinking, the Egyptians have founded them in some very scientific thought. They were naturalists. They live out in the wild. They knew where these birds were found, and so they were appropriate symbols for the gods that they chose to associate them with. Here are some images from Greece. On the left, we have a mosaic from the temple at Delphi. And if you look at all of the birds, they tend to be pretty much 100% fowl. So again, we have this obsession with the sort of birds that we are around a lot and also that we can use in our daily lives. On the upper right, that's a tile, most likely from a temple. That's Athena's owl. Another big image, we have Athena being embodied as an owl, but also the owl symbolizing wisdom, which would have been one of Athena's big attributes. On the bottom is an enamel cup of Zeus sitting there with his eagle, and that eagle was thought to be the only avian resident on Mount Olympus. And one of the interesting things about this cup is that we do revisit Zeus and the classical styles later. So if you keep this one in your mind, you can contrast that with what we see emerging later on, a couple hundred years, well, several hundred years down the road. Now I'm going to take a brief sidestep into Eastern art, just because this is also the time period in which we have this art emerging, and it does become important in Western culture later on. So I do want to mention it here so you can kind of keep that in mind. So we do have Chinese bird art several thousand, 5,000 to 8,000 years before the Common Era, an extremely long time ago. At around 1,100 years before the Common Era, we actually have bird and flower art emerging as a specific sort of field, and that really becomes specialized in the first millennium. And we have Asian artists who go out and sit in the wild and watch these birds in their natural habitat and try to capture their essence. And that's a very different style from what we see in the West. These people were not so interested in capturing the biologically accurate details, but the spirit of the animal. And that's why they, for thousands of years, were the only ones who actually went out in the wild and interacted with these species in their native habitat. And all of these images actually can be found, you can find very similar art today. The Chinese have very much persisted in a lot of these techniques. They've hung around for a long time. And a lot of Asian art, Korean art, you see some similar trends, and also Japanese art. All right, so now we already, again, although we've only briefly traveled through the timeline here, we can have another discussion about how science and art have interacted. And here we have an example of artists going out and conducting these bird surveys. And luckily, these bird surveys involve species that are still living, so not just the ones that have gone extinct. In some cases, this is just a byproduct of being an artist, so you go out and do a study of an animal just to get some practice, so that whenever you're commissioned to draw it, you actually have some experience and you're pretty good at it. And that's the case with this here. But we also see cases where artists have gone out and deliberately tried to catalog all the species that they see around them. On the left here is a tapestry that was done in order to place it in a religious setting. So this tapestry would have been used to illustrate all of God's bounty and all of the things that God has put on this earth. And that's why there are all those species that you can see in there. On the right is an image that would have been made for a particular person, so a wealthy donor who hired an artist to make this drawing, to showcase all the animals that he would have had out in his yard or out in his garden. So this is, again, kind of like a throwback to the Egyptian thing where they're using these birds as a symbol of status because they've amassed all these animals. And so in both cases here, we see that these artists have gone out and recorded all the species that are around them. And by looking at all of these different pieces of art through time, we can see, yes, the species was here at this time, or no, it wasn't. We can watch it as it moves from one area of the world to another by its appearance in art.